Hey guys, Political Junkie 2414 here, and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be doing my first ever prediction for the 2024 or 2026 United States Senate elections. It's been a while since I made a video. I apologize for that. It's been like a 4-month hiatus, but I'm back and I'm here. I think this is my first official video about the 2026 midterms, so we're going to get into it right away. Democrats right now are in the minority in the Senate after Republicans won back the majority in 2024. Republicans flipped Montana, Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. But Democrats did win Democrats did win Senate races in 4 states that Trump won on the same ballot. Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, Elisa Slotkin in Michigan, Ruben Gallego in Arizona, and Jackie Rosen in Nevada all outperformed Kamala Harris to win their states. And so Democrats right now, generally in the last couple cycles, have done pretty well in Senate races. I think this map is a lot more balanced than the 2024 map. There are free retirements in states that are, considered Democratic. Minnesota and New Hampshire are considered Democratic leaning. Michigan is a true top, considered a, true swing state by most. And so that is, giving the party cause for concern, but overall Republicans have more seats up than Democrats. The issue is Democrats are holding, the Democratic seats are generally more competitive, or more, Republicans have a better chance to win more Democratic seats, to expand their majority further than Democrats have to narrow it. So I think right now we're going to start off with the safe states here. Oregon, Illinois, Delaware, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts will be safe blue. Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, most of the Great Plains will be safe red for the Republicans. South Carolina will be as well. And I'm going to add Florida because Florida is a state that backed Trump by 14 points in 2024, voted for Marco Rubio and Ron DeSantis by double digits in 2022, and Republicans have recently, Senate Republicans recently confirmed Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, and so he had to leave his position, his seat, which he was reelected to for the third time in 2022, and so his official seat, the seat is not, the Senate term for it is not officially, up till 2028. But because of the resignation, they had to appoint an interim senator. Ashley Moody was that choice. She was the former Florida Attorney General, and she is running for the seat. Democrats right now don't really have a bench. I think most of their strongest candidates, especially House members, are staying put where they are because it is more confident. It's a better place they think it's a better, they have a better shot at winning than taking a risk at statewide office and then losing and not, not being able to run for their seats again without challenging, potentially Democratic incumbent, which would probably, which is kind of anathema to a lot of Democrats. I'm also going to put Alaska in there. Dan Sullivan's not the most popular guy. Mary Peltola has expressed some interest in running for this seat, but it seems like she's more interested in running for governor or her old House seat. So Alaska, moderately Republican state, not a huge, not a very Trumpy state, but Trump still did improve on his margin here in 2024, and I think if the election were held today, Sullivan would dominate. But it could still be likely, it could still be below safe, even if Peltola doesn't run. So with that, Democrats have 39 seats and Republicans have 48. They are a lot closer to the majority. In fact, because they hold the vice presidency with J.D. Vance, they would only need to win 2 more seats to get the majority. They could break a 50-50 tie, just as Kamala Harris did for the Democrats. In the first 2 years of Joe Biden's presidency. So we're going to start with the likely Democratic states, Colorado and New Mexico, both pretty, reliably blue states. Colorado is continuing to move to the left. John Hickenlooper and Ben Ray Lujan, I have little doubt that they will win re-election to these seats. New Jersey, Cory Booker may be in a bit of, may see a reduced margin because New Jersey's been showing signs of going to the right. 2024 was not a good year for Democrats in New Jersey, and they haven't really had a great year since 2020. Had a pretty close election for governor in 2021 and 2022. The House popular vote was kind of subpar for them, but I think with considering 2026 is a Republican midterm, and Democrats have shown recent success, recent strength, and have recently showed strength in special elections since Trump's second term began. It's likely that the national environment is bluer than it was in 2022 or 2024. So I think New Jersey could be safe if things get a lot better for Democrats, if they get back to where they were in 2020. When Booker also won by, I think he won by even more than Biden. He won by slightly more, 16 points. I think Biden won by like 15.9. But either way, Booker, I think right now, looking at a low double-digit victory. Then we will go to the some of the likely Republican states. We do have more likely Dem states, but I'm going to hold on those right now. Iowa and Ohio, both former swing states that have since become pretty Republican under Donald Trump. In fact, Ohio especially has elected has two Republican senators for the first time in almost 20 years. Sherrod Brown lost his re-election bid last year to Bernie Moreno, and he is considering running against John Husted, the appointee for this seat, which J.D. Vance won in 2022 but had to relinquish in 2024, after he got elected vice president. But I think Sherrod Brown's more likely to run for governor because that's a less polarized race. I also think he probably thinks it's a more viable option, but he has not ruled out a Senate run against Husted, John Husted, who's the replacement for Vance. I don't know if I said that. Iowa, Joni Ernst is running again. Democrats, I think, recently drew a challenger in some radio station host or something, or some market director, Nathan Sage, who kind of has a more blue collar, blue dog Democrat sort of vibe to him. But again, Iowa has become so much redder in recent years. Democrats don't really have a bench in this state. So I think right now Ernst is looking, like she's flying high. So that brings Republicans to the majority. There are 50 seats already. But, and Democrats are at 42, but, again, they're going to get more likely states. Texas is going to be a likely red state. It really depends. I think the margin really depends on John Cornyn or Ken Paxton being the GOP nominee. Cornyn, the more, is the current incumbent senator, more associated with the old school Bush wing of the Republican Party. He's, he's a very conservative guy, but he's not necessarily MAGA. Ken Paxton, on the other hand, is a very, very, much a MAGA Trump acolyte. And so Trump hasn't endorsed in this race yet. I think a lot of people are speculating that Ken Paxton will receive that endorsement. He is currently leading Cornyn in most of the polling, but again, if you don't get 50% in a Texas primary, I do believe you get a runoff. And so technically, usually primary challengers against senators, either the incumbent decides to retire, or, or they just win it. Usually we haven't had a serious primary challenge for most sitting senators for a while. I think the last sitting senator to lose a primary was Jeff Sessions' replacement in Alabama in 2017, the guy who lost to Roy Moore. I think his name was Luther Strange, but, fact check me on that if I'm wrong. So it is rather rare, but Republicans, if they do put up Ken Paxton here, I think it could happen even without Trump's endorsement. Certainly not if Trump endorses Cornyn. I think that would really help Cornyn, because he'd have the establishment and Trump behind him. But if, Trump co-endorses or stays out of the race or even backs Paxton, I think he's in a bit of trouble, especially if he backs Paxton. So I think, to get to my point, after all my rambling, I think Paxton would be more of a liability to Republicans here than Cornyn would. He has a lot of federal, he's been impeached by the Texas State House. He was acquitted by the state Senate, but he has a long history of corruption. And Democrats look like they're going to, it looks like Colin Allred, the nominee for Senate last year, is going to run again. He hasn't, he hasn't officially launched a campaign, but he seems like he's pretty eager to run again. I think he'd be a good candidate. I think Allred would do pretty well, especially now that he might have the potential to improve on his 2024 deficit, or the margin that he lost by in 2024, which was 8.5 points to Ted Cruz. But Trump also won the state against Harris by like 14 points. So, relatively speaking, Allred outran Harris by a pretty decent amount, more than some of these other winning Senate Democrats did in other states. So I think Allred against the Paxton versus Allred race could get interesting. A Cornyn versus Allred race I don't think would be super competitive. But either way, I struggle to see how Democrats win in Texas. I think that it's a much tougher nut to crack than Arizona and Georgia, just by the sheer amount of places, different demographics and the different locations, and just I think it's more culturally conservative than Arizona and Georgia. So then moving on to the final two likely Democratic states. In fact, Virginia, I completely forgot about Virginia. Mark Warner looks like he's going to run there, not official yet. If he doesn't, which I would be surprised by, even though he's really old. But if he doesn't, I would be, I think this race could get interesting. We'll have to see if Glenn Youngkin runs in that case, but I think Youngkin's got his eyes on the presidency in 2028. So right now, I think Warner would beat Youngkin anyway, but by, a reduced amount. So Minnesota and New Hampshire are these two Democratic, open Democratic seats. I think Jeanne Shaheen in New Hampshire, let me pull that up again. Jeanne Shaheen in New Hampshire, not as much of a surprise as Tina Smith in Minnesota. That Shaheen is retiring, I think I kind of expected that, but Smith took me completely by surprise. Peggy Flanagan, the current lieutenant governor of Minnesota, who hasn't really won a statewide election in her own right, looks like she's going to be the nominee, but I think she has the backing of most of the state's prominent Democrats. Angie Craig, a pretty, an overperformer from a swing district in the Minneapolis suburbs, looks like she might run. But she's getting crushed in some of the polling for this primary, hypothetical polling, that is, by Flanagan, which is really interesting. So I think it's really up in the air. I think a bruised primary could hurt Democrats in the general election, but again, Minnesota's a pretty stubbornly blue state. Hasn't voted for a Republican Senate candidate or a Senate candidate since 2002. It hasn't voted for a presidential candidate from the Republican Party since 1972. And if you look, even though Harris lost or won the state only by 4 points with Tim Walz as her running mate, Amy Klobuchar still did 11 points better, which was one of the biggest overperformances for any Senate Democrat of Harris, which isn't super surprising. Klobuchar, this was her worst election so far in terms of margin, but she was also up, it's in Republicans' defense, they also put up a pretty bad candidate, so I think this could have been a likely race otherwise. But again, Klobuchar is a special example. I think Minnesota Democrats don't have that much to worry about. It's a much friendlier state to them than some of the other ones in the Rust Belt. New Hampshire, on the other hand, could get interesting. Chris Sununu said he's not going to run. I could see him changing his mind, honestly, because Larry Hogan changed his mind after being pretty adamant about not running for Senate in 2022 and initially in 2024, but then he ran and he, forced Democrats to spend some money in that race, even though they ultimately beat him. But Chris Pappas is pretty much, he's a representative from the 1st District, which covers basically half the state. He's overperformed Harris and Biden in years past, and he's a pretty good candidate. I think he would make this race. He's the best possible candidate, I think, for any of these states. He's got the endorsements of the entire congressional delegation right now, except for Shaheen, who, is the retiring senator. She's probably going to stay out of it until, she sees, until the general election, when she'll probably endorse Pappas. And then you have Republicans right now. Looks like they might nominate Scott Brown if he decides to run. He was a senator from Massachusetts for a portion of Obama's first term, but he lost to Elizabeth Warren, and then he ran against Shaheen in New Hampshire in 2014 and lost then. So have to see what he does, but I think Pappas is the pretty clear favorite in this race right now. So I think Minnesota and New Hampshire have been pretty strong examples, or pretty strong states for Democrats. So even though Republicans have won the majority, they are still 2 seats away from their current majority, 53. So we'll have to see how these 4 races play out. Now, all of these, Michigan, North Carolina, and Georgia, these are all states that were decided by less than, 5 percentage points. Maine, I believe, was decided by around 5 points, 7 points. But Trump won 3 out of the 4 of these states. But Democrats hold seats in Michigan and Georgia. Michigan, right now, we will go to the first one. Gary Peters is retiring, which did surprise me, but he is, didn't surprise me as much as Tina Smith. It does look like this is going to be a more competitive primary than the primary for Debbie Stabenow's seat 2 years ago, which Elisa Slotkin won. Mallory McMurrow, state senator, Haley Stevens, a congresswoman from the Detroit suburbs, and the former Wayne County Health Director Abdul El Sayed are the current Democratic candidates. There could be more. Dana Nessel might get in. Joe Tate, the Speaker of the Michigan House, could get in. Republicans look likely to nominate Mike Rogers again, but Bill Huizenga or Tudor Dixon, candidates who have been, who either ran for who have either run for statewide office or have been heavily speculated as wanting to in the past, may do so. So Rogers might also get a pretty bruised primary. I think for the Democrats, I initially had, when Pete Buttigieg looked like he was going to run, he isn't necessarily what I'd call a full-on carpetbagger, but I think he would have some issues. He's only lived in the state for a couple of years. He's a pretty nationalized figure. I think he would do very well, and he would have done very well in the Democratic primary, but he would have had trouble in the general election. I think especially with minority voters. And I think right now he wants to run for president in 2028. So I think right now Haley Stevens, she's won a lot of competitive elections. She won a bruising primary against Andy Levin, who was the son of, who was part of the influential Levin family, which is a pretty influential family in Democratic politics in Michigan. So she knows how to run a campaign. I think that she's a pretty strong candidate. Not the most, she's not necessarily an overperformer, but I think she'd get the job done, and I think she would beat Rogers. I think McMorrow or El Sayed could as well, but I think Stevens right now is the most electable candidate. She's the most tested, I would say. So that brings Democrats to 46. We're going to go over to Maine. Maine is really a wild card. I don't know if I call it a wild card right now. I still could see Susan Collins changing her mind and retiring. But I think right now she wants to run again, and I think Republicans are smart enough in this case to realize Collins is the only Republican who could ever hope to win Maine. In a Senate race, she was, as I might have mentioned beforehand, this is the second time I've recorded this video, but of the 3 presidential election cycles that Donald Trump has been in, there was only one state in 2020 that didn't vote for the party that won it at the presidential level, and that was Maine, when Collins won unexpectedly by a pretty hefty amount. Now, I think if you look at her past elections, 2020 was a pretty bad performance compared to 2014, and that's because National Democrats invested in this race a lot more, but this was her closest race since her initial one in 1996, and so I think I think the main problem for Democrats in Maine is that they also have an open governor's race, and I think a lot of Democrats feel a lot more comfortable running for that because Collins is, I think really beloved by the people, or I don't know if I'd call her beloved. She has a pretty poor approval rating, but she seems to win over a lot of moderates and independents and Democrats in this state, even though even though a lot of them express, disagreements with some of her votes. Maine loves its centrists. Just look at Angus King. So I think Susan Collins right now would win re-election narrowly. I put it as a lean red state. I think this will be her closest race yet. But if Democrats get someone like Jared Golden to run, who did actually work for Collins, I think, and so I'm surprised that he's considering running against her, but I think he's more likely to run for governor than anything. If they get him, that can make it a really interesting race. But besides that, most of their candidates, aside from Janet Mills, are looking for governor, and Mills is pretty old. I mean, she's risen to national prominence. I think she's sued the Trump administration over her state's allowing transgender women to compete in girls' sports. But I think that she would even lose to Collins, but she'd definitely probably be the most viable candidate at the moment besides Golden. I would say the most viable and realistic candidate, but I don't even know if she's going to run. So Maine Democrats really have a problem with their bench right now. I think that a lot of those, it's not that there aren't people. I think it's just there aren't people who want to run against Susan Collins because she is a tried and tested incumbent. So that brings us down to our final two states here in North Carolina and Georgia. We both, these are both states that, voted for Donald Trump, both states with very, I should say that these are the two most vulnerable incumbents on either side of the aisle. North Carolina, Tom Tillis, I would say, most vulnerable Senate Republican, even more than Collins, and then Georgia, Jon Ossoff easily is the most vulnerable Democratic incumbent up for re-election next year. So I'm actually going to give both of these states to their, to the incumbent senators here. I know a lot of people think Tillis is going to face a primary challenger. I could see it, but I also see, he already kind of has drawn in challenger. A lot of people have talked about Laura Trump running, but she's flirted with the idea of running for Senate several times, doesn't seem to want to do it. Mark Robinson, who I think would just be a disaster in this race. He's, I think he's got the message from 2024 that he's a pretty unelectable candidate, so he's not looking to run for anything anytime soon. And Tillis has gained the endorsement of many GOP senators. He's got the most money on hand. So I think some of these hypothetical polls aren't great for him, but I do think he's going to win. And on the Democratic side, everybody's looking for Roy Cooper to run. I think personally right now, I would say he's probably going to run, but it's very hard to tell. I could see him running for president in 2028. But Wiley Nickel, I think if he'll be the Democratic nominee if Cooper does not decide to run, and he's won a swing seat before, but I don't think he would be strong enough to beat Tillis. Cooper's won several statewide elections in North Carolina. I think you look at some of these governors running in, deep blue, or, some of these governors from the opposite party running in their states, which are either deep blue or deep red, and, they do well, but then they don't, win. But they aren't able to overcome polarization. I think North Carolina is a bit different than that because it's a swing state perennially. It's just Democrats can do really well here, but they often can't get to the, they usually come up 1 or 2 points short. And I think Cooper could easily, bail them out in this race, or not bail them out, but I think he could really help them pick up this race. But that's to be seen. I don't know if he's going to run yet. I'm, kind of skeptical on that. So I think right now Tillis, is a narrow favorite here. He could also win against Cooper, but I would still give Cooper the advantage. And in Georgia, I have a similar kind of reasoning here. Jon Ossoff, I think, is a underrated incumbent. He's raised, I think, something like $30 million. $32 million in the first quarter of 2026 or 2025. Republicans are really waiting on Brian Kemp. He's been uncharacteristically quiet. Tim Scott, the NRSC chair for this cycle, has very much wanted him to run. Kemp, I think, could run, is probably, I honestly have a feeling that he's not going to run and that Republicans are going to have a more crowded primary here. And if you look at the polling, which, again, polling's not everything. I think Ossoff wouldn't win against Brad Raffensperger by 14 points, or against Buddy Carter by 8 points, but I think he would have a better chance of winning against these candidates than Brian Kemp, who seems to, be the only candidate in this slate of polling that was able to beat Ossoff. So I think Kemp, not unbeatable if he decides to run, similar to Cooper, but would be a favorite here. I think I would put this race in the lean Republican column, and I would, if Kemp runs, I would put North Carolina in the tilt D column if Cooper runs. But right now, Ossoff, very strong incumbent. I think he would even put up a fight against Kemp, but, I don't think he'd win. But it remains to be seen if the Georgia governor decides to get in. If he doesn't, I think I could see a lot of people running. If Marjorie Taylor Greene runs, this race could even be likely Democratic. It would be really bad. But any of these other candidates, I think, would be decent. I think Buddy Carter would probably be the nominee, maybe Mike Collins, just because of his family. His family is, I think, run for Senate or has held, U.S. Congressional office before. I think his father did. So possible that he gets the, run for it, or Brad Raffensperger runs for it. But either way, after all that rambling, we just don't know enough, I think, about Georgia or North Carolina to really, for me to bet against these incumbents right now. So this does kind of look like a disappointing Senate map right now. There are no flips. I have Democrats at 47 seats, Republicans at 53 seats. There's no, net change, no nothing, no flips, no, it's not like one seat flips one way and another seat flips the other to cancel it out. But, things can change. I think right now, 2026, much like 2022 and 2018, the Senate is likely to stay with the party of the incumbent president. That's usually how it goes. I think, in 2018, Republicans had a pretty good Senate map. It was even better than 2024, and they held on to seats even though Democrats, they flipped Democratic seats while Democrats struggled to flip some of their seats or hold on to some of them, even though they did relatively well. And in 2026, I think that Democrats aren't facing nearly as bad a map, but they are going to need to focus on playing defense. And I think their real goal should be get to 48, 49 seats and just hope for the best come 2028 when there's possibly a, Democratic leaning environment, and Democrats winning the Senate. The Democrats, I think, have a better chance at winning back the Senate majority in the next presidential election. But a lot of that does depend on how well they do in these midterms. So we'll have to see what happens here. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Hope to put out some more content soon. But of course, the springtime is busy, busy, busy. So there will be a lot more content over the summer. I will talk about the governor's races, the House races, start getting back into the groove of that. I wanted to thank you all for your patience with this Senate election prediction video, which I've been delaying for months. Just a lot's been coming up. But yeah, if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, share this video with someone who you think would enjoy it. And yeah, thank you guys, and I'll see you guys next time when I talk about all things politics. See ya. Oh, and tell me, what you think is gonna, how you think these races are gonna go. All right, see ya.